Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this meeting on the new sexism. We've got three speakers for you today. Judith, who's a leading member of the SWP. She's also the author of a short book, Sexism and the System, the editor of Socialist Review, and she has an article in this the ISJ this quarter. We've also got Nina Power, who's the author of One-Dimensional Woman and a senior lecturer of philosophy at Roehampton. And finally, we've got Hester Eisenstein, who's over from the States to speak, and he's also the author of a new book called Feminism Seduced. So I'm going to take the speakers in that order. They're going to speak for approximately half an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions and contributions from the floor. So I'll hand you over to Judith.
That's not half an hour each, just in case you're wondering how we're going to do this. You will have time to contribute as well. Right, well, I want to start with saying, well, you know, this phrase, the new sexism, it's like maybe did we ever not have sexism and suddenly it's new again or something? Well, just to clarify, I think the term new sexism is because we're talking about a development that maybe looks a bit different, and why is it? And I want to identify what makes anything new about the sexism we're experiencing today compared to just good old-fashioned sexism that's been around for a very long time. And I think some of the difference is because it comes after decades where women are meant to have had it all, aren't we? We are represented in layers of society that there wouldn't have been women 100 years ago. We have got jobs that women may have been barred from by law or perhaps just by tradition over a couple of generations ago. And so much so, you know, in terms of how far we've come and the gains that we've made, that some people think that not only do we have it all, but we got too much, don't they? I mean, there is people who think we live in a post-feminist society because really all of that women's rights stuff was fine for the 1970s, but now, hey, you don't need it. We're living in this society. And I mean, there's plenty of people complain. I don't know if people remember Michael Burke, you know, the journalist, who said that masculinity had gone out of fashion, and he was really pissed off because there was too many women in the media, too many women in the BBC and Channel 4 and everything else. Well, I don't think so, do you? I mean, do you think we're complaining that there's too many women who are high profile? You know, apart from, you know, the people that want to do all the sort of the pundits who want to talk about what the wives of the politicians are wearing, you know, which shoes they're wearing today and all the rest of it. You know, really, women in the media aren't necessarily, you know, all powerful, that Michael Burke is getting his knickers in a twist. I think we should say that really male chauvinist pigs should have gone out of fashion a long time ago, people like him. The fact he's got the confidence to say something like that today shows that there is people who think that there is time for a shift change, time to keep these women down. But I think the key thing about the new sexism is that actually some of it absorbs and has assimilated some of the history of struggle, of the language, of the aspirations, of struggles of women to have independence, to have sexual liberation, to be an independent woman. And therefore you have a situation where really, for one of the greatest fights, part of the women's liberation movement was the fight for sexual liberation, for women to have sexual confidence, to assert themselves, to assert their desires, to not just be a mere object for somebody else. And actually what the new sexism and what some other authors have called the raunch culture or pornification of popular culture or whatever they've said is actually, it is in a way that us challenging the idea that we're just more than mere objects for other people's desires. It's turned this desire and this liberation into something that's become its opposite. You know, that we're actually being turned all the more into objects of desire than actually the subjects of our own desires and what we want to do. And what I mean by this is, I think that in ever more shocking ways, there is a seepage, if you like, into popular mainstream culture of images, values, behaviour, and et cetera, from what people would call in the selling for sex industry. You've got a situation where, you know, if you think of the Belle de Jour fantasy, you know, on the TV, where prostitution is really a fantastic career choice, where you get to wear lots of fancy clothes, meet a lot of rich men, and have a lot of sex if you're into sex. I mean, that's really how prostitution in some parts of popular culture is shown, not the reality of what it is for the majority of women who find themselves in prostitution. And I think when you talk about things like the lap dancing clubs, now stripping is not a new phenomenon, no way. But stripping down the back street, being a bit ashamed, is one thing. But big corporate billion-dollar business, which is what Spearmint Rhino and those other lap dancing clubs, this has taken on, you know, a new stage. And not only is it big business, but hey, it's so fun and ironic in this post-liberated world that, come on, women, get down there too, have a good night out. And if you don't want to do that, well, you're a bit of a prude. Aren't you a bit repressed? don't you get with the program? You know, this is all about having fun and, you know, being sexually liberated. And so this is what's going on. It's the twist, if you like, of selling it to us as something that is empowering and liberating. And this goes for everything. I mean, there was the pole dancing company that teaches pole dancing and saying it's part of, you know, helping with women's self-esteem issues, to give them physical confidence about their body. So learn to gyrate around a pole, you know, and this is going to help with your self-esteem. Or there is the course. And I mean, you know, the tabloids love this sort of thing. But actually, I do think we have to be critical of it as well. A course, 6 weeks course on how to walk on your high heels, you know, again, to deal with your self-esteem issues. Now, I'm all for people, you know, any sense of having ability to have self-esteem, but the idea that the only way to build your self-esteem as a woman is to fulfill this narrow caricature of what is a sexy woman, for me, isn't good enough. This isn't liberating. It isn't empowering. It's actually fulfilling a new sort of image that we've got to do, got to conform to. It's not more choice. And so therefore, I think that what has happened is what capitalism does to everything if we let it. Any sort of rebellion and difference can be assimilated and sold back to us to make a profit for somebody if we let it. And therefore our sexual liberation, the fact that women have sexual confidence, can express their desires and be autonomous, is actually can be in itself assimilated and sold back to us as, well, that means you want to hang out in a lap dancing club, or that means you might want to wear 10 feet tall stilettos, or whatever it happens to be. And actually this is how the thing can be distorted. So, you know, so companies, you know, big peace movement, we can sell you trainers with peace signs on them. Or you're into food that hasn't been through the big conglomerate with lots of chemicals, so we'll have big corporate organic food business. You know, isn't it? Things can be assimilated by capitalism in that way. And I mean, even to be honest, other aspects of sexual liberation is, you know, the idea that because men clearly do some more housework than they did because of women working everything else, you can see cleaning products advertised at men with turbo in the title and this sort of thing, you know, turbo oven cleaners. Those are directed at men, so they don't feel embarrassed about the fact that they actually do some cleaning, which is seen as a woman's thing. And look out for it now. There's a whole host of these things. But this is how the system, if you like, can adapt in some way to changes, but can try and absorb them to do the only thing it wants to do, really, bottom line, which is to make a profit. And I think that when we look at this, and when I talk about the idea that sexual liberation has become another commodity, you are talking about a situation where there is a prism through which capitalism throws everything. It distorts it. And that's what I think it is doing to the idea of what is women's sexuality. And I think the idea of this idea of sexual liberation with a twist, the twist is we're being sold commodification, but we're being told it's empowering and wonderful, does mean that we have to respond to it in a different way. And I think, you know, so therefore, when people say, oh, it's just a choice to do this, it's just a choice that people want to be stick thin and have enormous breasts, and if they go and get cosmetic surgery to fulfill this, you know, dream of theirs, well, that's their own individual choice. Well, I think we have to look at it a little bit more critically, don't we? Why is it that breast enhancement surgery is on the huge increase? You know, there is something to be said, isn't there, about society? That women feel defined about the cup size of their bra. This is not something that we fought for. This is backwards looking, isn't it? Towards the idea of us trying to look like a Barbie doll, which is actually something that should have really gone out of fashion in the 1950s. And I think all of this, whether it's now the new extremes of toe shortening so that, you know, your toes don't hang over the front of your stilettos, or the heel implants, so you've got some padding for those big shoes, you name it. There's all sorts of new things they think up that you didn't even know you needed, you know, in order to fulfill this, a gendered torture, if you like, to crush you into this narrow cliche of what a woman should look like. And I mean, I just think it's degrading for women and for men. Degrading for women in an obvious way, degrading for men, that actually this is what men maybe want if you're a heterosexual, out of how women should look and appear and feel about their bodies. You might as well get us on a shelf with a price tag on us. It's so obviously turning us into a commodity. And I think this is really what Karl Marx talked about in terms of how things can be turned into a commodity in modern capitalism. A situation where really even the most sort of intimate parts of our lives, our sexuality, our ability to labour, get turned into something alien to us, something that can be bought and sold. And this is what is happening. And I think, therefore, one thing I want to make clear is for us, for me as a socialist, as a revolutionary, I don't want to turn around and actually be, censorious about some of the stuff I don't like that's around, whether it's lads mags or whatever. I don't believe banning, crushing, saying this is, the Tories do. They make a fuss about the sexualization of children, but they come from it from a different point of view from me as a revolutionary. I want more sexual openness, more confidence, more explicit and sympathetic sex education in schools for young people. I don't want to crush it and put it back in the box. I don't want to go back to the 1950s where people didn't even have the language to express their desires and needs. I want to have it more openness. So, this is, you can get accused sometimes, can't you? Well, you're just being prudish. We want this, I don't want to clamp down on these things. Well, no, I don't want to clamp down on anything, but I want more choice, real self-expression. And therefore we don't stand on the Tories in that, with the Tories in that at all, because the Tories just want us to be demure housewives or walking incubators with no rights to abortion and all the rest of it. It's made clear, isn't it, by what they've said about the family. Frank Field is now playing the game behind them about saying all we want is a man to look after us. That's all that women want. And I believe this is something that is we should reject, because for me, the role of the family is actually what structures and shapes the whole role that women play in the system. Yes, 50% almost of the workforce in Britain are women. Yes, most adult women work for the majority of their adult life, but the fact is we're still defined by the private sphere of the home as being really where our main life should be, and therefore everything else we should be accept flexible, low-paid jobs. But for me, that actually, it shows that how the family still plays an important role in the roots of women's oppression today. And I think, it's eulogized everywhere, isn't it, as the ultimate dream for us all, whether it's in advertising or by the politicians or the magazines and everything else. And actually, for me, I think that we actually, the place for us to find our liberation for these sorts of stereotypes and cliches that we're constantly meant to fulfill is actually in fighting collectively. And actually, I don't know how many of you were in the opening rally on Thursday night. I thought one of the high points was the BA cabin crew woman speaking, because she showed me, when people talk about the working class being feminized, well, if it's being feminized by a woman like her, this is something I would be jolly pleased about. But I believe, because people often talk about it becoming more precarious and people can't fight and can't organise. Actually, women are a permanent part of the workforce. We're here to stay. We're not going back in the box. Whatever the Tories might want, they need us as well. And therefore, for me, people like that woman, whose name we can't even say because it's so backward in this country that trade unions can't even say their names for fear of victimisation. But women like that, organising collectively, can challenge the sexist stereotypes, because those women, the cabin crew, are the perfect sexist stereotype, aren't they? How they have to dress, makeup, it's all in their contract. And yet when they fight, they are workers. When they organise, they are workers. And for me, that's the opportunity both to fight against the stereotypes and the cliches and all of the sexist imagery, as well as fight for something a lot different, a society really, where women are not discriminated against and not trivialised and not treated as sex objects for other people, but can play a true part, equal part of building a socialist society.
Sorry, I just need to make a quick announcement. Anna Gluckstein, Natalie's mum, could you please go to the creche if you're in this meeting?
Natalie's mum.
Okay. Oh, it's not Natalie's. Okay, sorry. I think I've got that right. Anyway, sorry, our next speaker is Nina Power. As I said, she's the author of One-Dimensional Woman, and she's a senior lecturer in philosophy at Roehampton University.
Yeah, thank you. Is the mic working? Yeah? All right. Okay. Well, this paper, I'm not going to do that political rousing speech because it's not really my thing, so I'm going to read some sort of facts and quotes and things. Sorry. But the title of my paper is The New Sexism and the Recession. I think, obviously, the title of this panel is The New Sexism. Untangling the nature of this purported new sexism is a tricky task. Is it so new, as Judith asked? Where does it lie? Who perpetuates it? To my mind, though, the question of sexism, new or otherwise, is inseparable from the question about women's global relation to the economy and the way in which women are positioned in the labour force. Even more specifically, it requires looking at what has happened to the labour force in relation to the current economic crisis and seeing how the differential valuation of men and women as workers and of the way in which work is positioned sometimes as women's work, and we can talk about the feminisation of labour and all of these kinds of things, about the rise of the service industry and so on, is played out. And I think there are some interesting and perhaps surprising shifts, and some of these shifts are quite kind of difficult to analyse in a way, try and work out why they've happened in terms of who gets laid off and why. In January this year, The Economist, that bastion of kind of feminist thought, ran an issue dedicated to the fact that for the first time in history, women made up more than 50% of the American workforce. Okay, and this is if you can see the issue, it's kind of battered, but they use Rosie the Riveter as this kind of great hero. We did it, is the slogan. They herald this fact as something extremely positive. They said women's economic empowerment is arguably the biggest social change of our times. Just a generation ago, women were largely confined to repetitive menial jobs. They were routinely subjugated to casual sexism and were expected to abandon their careers when they married and had children. Today, they say, millions of brains have been put to more productive use. I like that kind of behavioural description of brains being used. Clearly, then, for the pro-free market economist, women's mass and now quantitatively superior inclusion in the workplace, the more than 50%, is a good thing. There are problems, though, that even they have to acknowledge. Women are still underrepresented at the top of companies, they say. Only 2% of bosses in the US and only slightly more in the UK. They are paid significantly less, as we know. They further point out that, quote, juggling work and child rearing is difficult. But they say there are plenty of cheaper, subtler ways, other than using the state to help them out, in which governments can make life easier for women. They could close schools at midday, thus allowing women to pick up their kids in the afternoon and somehow work as well. The US could introduce, they say, a useful and humane length of time for maternity leave. Whilst The Economist is purporting to look at the bigger structural picture, there are, not surprisingly, a series of questions left over and unanswered. We have the obvious assumption underlying their piece that women must still nevertheless be responsible for childcare or be the primary carer, even as their entry into the workplace is to be celebrated, not least because they are paid, quote, significantly less. We have the awareness but not the exploration of the central contradiction between production and reproduction. Children are seen as a problem to be dealt with by shorter hours at school, for example, but do not necessitate any more significant reflection on the central and contradictory demands of capitalism, namely the long-term demand for the replenishment of the workforce combined with the desire not to pay for it in the short term. We can see the most tragic examples of this kind of contradiction in the way in which richer countries can cherry-pick the employees they want, doctors, nurses, engineers and so on, men and women, from poorer countries, whilst leaving those countries bereft of homegrown talent that those countries have invested by educating them in the first place. The asymmetry of capitalism pays no heed to the specific demands of individual countries if it can use differential pay to cross boundaries, while simultaneously relying on a nationalist and racist rhetoric of anti-immigration and quotas when from time to time the economy shrinks. Back to women. We think of women's mass entry into the workforce as a positive thing because we believe it allows women to have greater political and social power. This is absolutely true. Certainly we cannot go backwards, as Judith said. We now know, for example, Marx and Engels talked about this, that women do not have any natural domestic role to play. Women do not have a natural position. There is no natural role at all, in a way. Yet if the kind of work that women are doing is actually removing them from the possibility of having social and political power, which would be one of the long-term ambitions of feminism in relation to work, i.e. by paying them incredibly badly for long hours, forcing them to rely on the exploitation of other, often poor immigrant women to care for their children so that they themselves can go out to work, by not allowing them to join unions and so on, then the emancipatory dream of a feminism that sees work as the solution to the shackles of patriarchy is utterly incomplete, if that work is yet another form of oppression. We do not resolve or take apart the model of the patriarchal breadwinner by adding women to the roster, making both partners in a couple work for the same or less money than would have been the case several decades ago with a single breadwinner. If there is indeed a so-called man session, that's a lovely word, a man session taking place in the US at least, okay, so the idea that more men are being laid off than women, it is not simply because the kind of work that men and women tend to do have been disproportionately affected by the economic downturn. Okay, so this is the argument that, for example, building work slows massively as the housing market collapses, and this disproportionately affects men because men are more likely to be builders and that sort of thing. It's also in part because employers know they can pay women less, particularly if they don't have pesky European things like maternity pay to worry about. As one writer in The Atlantic puts it, could it be that the advantage men have enjoyed regarding pay differentials is coming back to haunt them now? Women have been making around 78 cents to every dollar men make, holding experience and actual job constant. In a recession where cost-cutting is at a premium, it makes good economic sense for companies to cut the higher cost, equal-performing employee. So given the historic and ongoing pay differential between women and men are getting cut at higher rates. This is not emancipation for anyone, clearly. It is a race to the bottom in which everyone loses, men and women. And I think this is the sort of crucial point, that capitalism can selectively remember when men and men and women are women. It decides when it's useful to describe them in that way. 3 minutes, that's perfect. On the cultural level, we've witnessed a kind of backlash against the kind of work hard, play hard image of the woman that emerged in the 90s, the idea of the ladette. Clearly, there's a class dimension here as well, the fear of a kind of drunken, unconstrained working-class woman who's kind of sexually libertarian or whatever. But there's also a broader kind of disapproval. You can join the workforce, but don't spend your money in a way that makes your sex vulgar. The feminine supplement, the so-called pinkification or princessification, if that's even really a word, the princessification of young girls in particular can be seen in some sense, I think, as a way of warding off the fear of female achievement, total female achievement. You can get top grades and top jobs, but for goodness sake, act nicely about it. Don't frighten the horses and so on. Crush your enemies, pamper yourself. Sorry, I don't know where I wrote that. I think it's extremely important, though, that we place these cultural shifts and these kind of like cultural backlashes in the wider economic context and work out what role they play vis-à-vis the shifting patterns of male-female employment, particularly in a time of economic crisis and recession. Far more importantly, to my mind, than sort of ghettoized questions of pornification or hypersexualization or even debates about sex work, although they are important, my worry here is that if you just focus on those kind of questions of sexuality and so on, that it becomes a kind of moral and aesthetic question and not a political and economic question and not a global contextual question. I think what we really need to be looking at if we are to be Marxist feminists is really the question of women's labour in the global context and what it truly means for women to have entered into the workforce in such unprecedented numbers, particularly when the emergence of women anywhere near the top depends so heavily on the second-hand internal exploitation of women at the bottom. Thank you.
Okay, our third speaker is Hester Eisenstein. She's the Professor of Sociology at Queen's College, and I can't read that bit either. She's written several books, including one on contemporary feminist thought, and her latest book is Feminism Seduced. So, Hester.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel. And I'm going to just bring a little U.S. perspective to the discussion. And what just caught my eye in preparing for today was an article that appeared in the New York Times in, I think it was June 14th this year, by a guy named Ross Douthat, D-O-U-T-H-A-T. And he was talking about the fact that there were two very prominent corporate women running for primaries, Senate primaries, which is the first round of election in California. One is Carly Fiorina, who had run Hewlett-Packard till they fired her, and the other was Meg Whitman, who was the head of eBay. So very rich, very powerful corporate women now entering politics. And he said this was an absolute indicator of the triumph of feminism. Now, the ideas of the women's movement, said he, are totally mainstream. And, you know, it's almost like in neon lights. Women can do anything. Women can have it all. And there was a furious response, of course, especially on a listserv that I'm on, which includes some distinguished feminist historians like Barbara Winslow and Roz Baxendale. And they put on the listserv the answers that the eloquent, the informed, the detailed, intelligent answers that the New York Times did not print, trying to refute this thesis. So I think it's a very important kind of moment, because to me it signals the success of capitalist ideology, which preaches equal opportunity, not equality of outcomes, by the way. equal opportunity, and female power. So the argument is discrimination is over. Women are no longer victims, as we've heard. They can play with sexuality the way men do. They can play with power the way men do. End of story. And so this notion that this kind of entry of powerful corporate women into the political process signals the end of any need to fight discrimination against women. So, and of course, this signals a certain kind of feminism which is devoid of any critique of the status quo. It's very celebratory. And I guess I was thinking about this, and my mind inevitably turned to Sarah Palin. Why does everybody laugh when you say Sarah Palin? It's like automatic, right? And I think because encapsulated in Sarah Palin a lot of very interesting contradictions. So she now is running around. As you know, she was governor of Alaska, but she got tired of it after she wasn't elected vice president, thank the Lord. And so now she's become a poster girl for the Tea Party, which is our new political phenomenon on the right. And she's an interesting character because, of course, she represents what feminism fought for, the right of women to all areas, to enter all areas of political and social and economic life, right? That was one of the major themes of 70s feminism. And of course, she's against most of what we would call the typical feminist agenda. She opposes abortion. And actually, she has chose to give birth to a Down syndrome child, which in a certain way shows a lot of courage rather than have an abortion. But she uses that then to beat everybody else over the head if they choose to take a different path. And she represents also a certain kind of dialed-up Reaganism, if I can put it that way. And the argument is the state should take a back seat to business, to the market, to the free market. So it's a quasi-libertarian position, which always fascinates me. People run for office trashing the state, you know. It's a kind of a contradiction. But I guess they're running for office to get elected and then limit the role of the state, except for their job. So it's a neoliberal position, all power to the market. And it's the Tea Party people say amazing things. I don't know if you follow it over here, but it's pathologically anti-state. Anti-government intervention, anti-anything Franklin Roosevelt ever did. And my favorite thing, people walking around with posters during the big debate about healthcare. You know, we had this convulsive debate about healthcare recently, and my favorite poster was, "The government should keep their hands off my Medicare." Now, Medicare, is a government program which was brought in, an extension of healthcare that was brought in by Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. So isn't that wonderful? Government should keep their hands off my Medicare. Incredibly ignorant, contradictory, but there's something there. It's galvanizing a certain level of the electorate. Now, you know that when Obama won his health care bill, it was by catering to preserving the near monopoly power of health insurance companies. Ironically, seen as unwarranted extension of state power, even though it was a total rejection of anything like what you have here or they have in Canada or in France or even in Australia, it really just enshrines the power of the insurance companies. And yet it was fought tooth and nail as the state moving too much into our lives. So I think that to go back to what has capitalism done to feminism, it's really no surprise that capitalist ideological forces have had such success in reshaping the original ideas of women's liberation. I mean, after all, this is what they do full time. But what I want to specify here, and picks up a little bit of what previous speakers said, is that when the central demand of the women's movement for paid work was accommodated by corporations seeking women's cheaper labor, that demand was effectively divorced from those other demands that would have led to more fundamental change. And just to give you a brief list, universal free childcare, an end to sexual violence, rape, incest, battering, an end to militarism and war, an end to the possibility of sexual self-determination, an end to the objectification of women and other oppressed people, and most fundamentally, an end to hierarchies of race, class, gender, and so forth. So the selective acceptance, thank you, of this one demand, which met the needs of corporations for a whole new reserve army of labor, both in the developed world and in the global South, leads to a new level of sexual exploitation, from low-wage, insecure jobs to maquiladoras or sweatshops to massive trafficking in women, which is such an incredible increase in recent years. And so I think that we have to see this clearly and say, yes, we want to hold on to that. I'm not suggesting what the other speakers, yes, I'm not saying let's go back to the kitchen. Obviously, entry to paid work represents independence, represents choice for women. But taking that by itself is not enough. We have to go back to the rest of that feminist agenda, which is really an agenda for socialist feminism. Thank you.
Okay, now I'd like to open it up to people in the audience. Just so you're aware, there's a microphone at the front of the hall, and we'd invite you to come up and speak there because the meeting's being recorded and so everybody can hear you. And if you limit your contributions to around 3 minutes, that'd be fantastic. So the lady at the front first.
I might sound a bit naive for those that actually did fight for women's liberation all those years ago. But, I mean, given the fact that we live in an unjust world, I'm sure I might be speaking for millions and millions of other women that actually can relate to what I see as the problem. I mean, there's no two ways that the need for women's liberation was created by capitalism. Because I go back to where I was born and brought up. How do you justify a woman's liberation if you look at a mother with 2 children, she's the gardener, she's the cleaner, she's the cook, and the husband goes and drinks alcohol and comes in the evening and expects the food to be laid on the table for him. Or, which is definitely is happening now. I grew up under it, and I'm the product of it. And that is why I try to grapple with why do women think that women's liberation means sexual liberation. Of course, if I want to have sex with a man, I'll have sex with a man. If I want to have sex with a woman, I'll have sex with a woman. That's none of your business, which is why I'm proud today that there is pride along the street showing the whole world that we have to liberate ourselves, not against the man, because the man is not our problem. It is the system that we live in that actually tells a man that because you've got those 2 balls in front of you, you can do what you like, whilst I, as a woman, I still do it now. I still work 5 days a week. I do the gardening. I do the cooking. And why is that? Because I can't live in a filthy house, I can't live in a filthy garden, and I've got a man who thinks that because he's a man, he can live a man's life, which means coming home every evening and drinking alcohol. We have to change the system. We shouldn't focus on the liberation. Women today, tell me if I'm finished time. Women today are dying from backstreet abortions, and we are in England here being told by fucking hell, by assholes that we cannot abort under medical care. Who the fuck should tell me when I should abort a baby I don't need? Fucking
So I've got the lady who indicated at the back there. And while she's walking up, I'd like to encourage anybody that's got any short questions or just wants to say something brief. You don't need to make a long contribution.
Hi, I'd like to talk about how I find as a young woman it can be really difficult to stand up to this idea that choosing to be a stripper or be on the front of Nuts magazine is empowering, like that it is our choice. I think we can look at a few facts to see that it's not that simple because we are being encouraged to fit a very, very small agenda of what we should look like in terms of being skinny, in terms of being sexy in a very particular way. Eating disorders are higher than they've ever been. And when you look at South America, where eating disorders are the highest in the world, you have 2-year-olds who are refusing to eat because they're already internalizing the ideas that they have to remain slim. I think another interesting fact is that in the past few years, we had a number of additional strip clubs open up in the Camden Borough. And since that's happened, the number of sex attacks in the area has gone up substantially. Another point that shocked me, but is a very good counter-argument to the idea that it's empowering, is that most strippers actually have to pay to work in the clubs that they strip in. And so often, they'll go home having made no money because the clubs will bring in dozens of strippers and they're all colluding for the men's attention. Finally, I just want to make a point about if we are empowered by being beautiful and slim and young and sexy, what happens when it goes away? I'm an actor, and recently there was a survey done which showed that for all the actors that are shown on dramas on British television, it's 2-to-1 men to women. And of the women that are on the screens, hardly any are middle-aged or old. I'm literally in a situation where I'm expected to bow out when I get wrinkles and I'm no longer considered attractive, therefore as a woman, no longer considered viewable. There is a petition to change this, to get equal representation and realistic representation of women on our screens. I urge you to sign it. If you go online to www.gopetition.com and write search for equal representation of women, you should find the petition. Thank you very much.
Okay, I've got the woman with the blonde hair at the back and then the woman down here with the red hair.
The point that Nina made about women in the recession, I think, is really, really important, because that's what we're confronted with now, is a horrible recession, the deepest since the 1930s. And in some ways, it's very different to the 1930s, because in the 1930s, the ideology was churned out, particularly where I am in Ireland, that women should not work, and they were forced back in the home, and in the States, I believe, too. Mm-hmm. You know, there was a whole promotion of the family, which then led on to the 1950s cornflake packet woman and so on. In some ways, at least, we're not in that situation. And I think the contradiction of the thing really does show that, you know, the very people who are now in work will be in the forefront. And I know what you're saying when you say that low pay and the race to the bottom is another form of oppression. It is a worse form of exploitation or a race to the bottom, but it also has the potential of that BA striker and so on. So it is really contradictory in that way. And maybe the cuts and so on, we'll see lots women fighting on that. And certainly in Ireland, the fight over hospitals and so on is often led by women. So there is that potential if politically we can deal with it. Just the second point I wanted to make was that the legacy of neoliberalism and the boom and this horrible kind of ideology of individualism that has led to this horrible sexist culture and so on, I think in lots of ways we have to really challenge that individualism. And I'm really just kind of asking the question, you know, to the speakers, that I'm not sure that feminism really challenges that individualism. In lots of ways, feminism plays into that individualism. And that's where, you know, it's so encouraging to see a Marxist platformer talking about socialism and feminism, because I think it's a real opportunity to develop a real Marxist today thing that can cut across the weakness of a feminism that appeals across the class, because as we all know, the upper classes don't suffer the same kind of oppression, and really build, in the spirit of Zetkin and Luxemburg, a real new socialism from below that puts women's liberation at the centre of it.
Okay. I've got, you next, and then the woman with the blonde hair there.
I also wanted to come back to some of the things that Nina was saying, because I thought it was a really interesting way to put some of what you ended on the question of, if you just talk about the cultural aspects of women's oppression, actually, are we kind of doing down the struggle for women's liberation, which should be centred in the economic and political sphere? And I think that's right. That's where it should be centred. But I think there is a real link between the two. And I think it's interesting you say it, because actually part of the compromises, really, of second wave feminism was a retreat in the late 1970s and the 80s. Actually, I was part of a young woman then, sort of going along to women's meetings and arguing. There was a real retreat into the notion of individualism, of the questions of cultural issues, of relationships between men and women, of the way in which women were oppressed sexually and so on, which retreated from the struggle for equal pay that was in the workplaces and so on, and was part of a move to the right of a whole layer of second wave feminists who I think are partly the reason why now the arguments around the new sexism are so important that the left has them, because that whole period of backlash of feminists arguing that it was all right to become a stripper, that was empowering to women to sell back those images, that there was, you could buy into the alienation of sexuality and buy and sell ourselves on the market would be an empowering thing to do, which a whole part of some of the women's movement did buy into for at least a period of time, that's now being challenged again, I think, by some of the younger feminists, was a real retreat back. And I just want to kind of say really about the question of why it's right about economic and political power, but why I think part of the problem of understanding how to fight for women's liberation is that, of course, the entry of women into the workforce takes place on uneven terms, so we end up into routine and boring jobs, but so do most men. The working class is full of routine, boring, badly paid jobs in which the oppression and sexism means that women suffer the worst of that, but it's part of a collective experience. And a tiny number of the second wave feminists and women before them may have been now allowed to exploit equally the rest of us, but actually it is in work that our economic and political liberation does lie, for the very simple reason that where the chains of your oppression, where the alienation of sexism arises, is in the relationships of production inside of the workplace. It's the same place where our power to overthrow it comes from. Every woman that's part of a workplace has the potential to both liberate herself individually from sexist relationships, because there's the alternative both economically and in terms of aspirations to do it, but also, of course, in the collective struggle, it's where we found our liberation. Just a quick one point on it, really. The Russian Revolution was an amazing event of a rising. It was begun by women workers who refused to obey, actually, an argument from the local left committees that they shouldn't strike on International Women's Day and walk and march and so on, that kicked off the revolution. It's one in which they argued all the way through for women's rights, and where they took dirty sexist foremen who used to sexually harass them on the shop floors and dumped them in the Neva in wheelbarrows, because that is where our liberation lies, in the collective action of power where we can overthrow capitalism.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be followed by the young woman on the second row there.
Hester, am I speaking into the microphone?
No, just
no.
Yeah, do you?
Hester, I want to say that we laugh at Sarah Palin because she's a joke, first of all. But I had a question about, now that women are entering the workforce, how do we tackle the way that women are oppressing other women through childcare and through cleaning jobs? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the young woman here will be followed by the woman with the blonde hair. Just there. You can.
I see women's liberation as part of a wider struggle, not just connected to capitalism and the economy, but also to things such as racism, because I think, and prejudice, and that's not just for developed countries, but also developing countries where women are still suffering and sort of really shouldering a lot of the burdens of, war and military action, which has a disproportionate effect on women. And I think for as long as that situation applies, where women in developing countries or war-torn countries are going through that, I think that always holds the threat of regression back to old attitudes for the rest of us. Because I don't think we can truly say that as women, as a collective across the world, we're liberated if this is the situation. And a question I had for the panel is, how does women liberation in Western countries influence and affect women's liberation in countries where women don't have as many rights? Yep. Thank you.
Fantastic. The woman here will be followed by the woman on the floor down there.
Yeah, I think Hester said that the way that feminism has been kind of incorporated and is used to justify all kinds of terrible things today is about the success of capitalist ideology. And I think I kind of disagree with that in terms of the extent of their success, really, because I think the way that feminism is used today, by people like Sarah Palin or our own kind of female MPs here, is a sign of the success of that movement a generation ago, but also of the limitations of it. And I think in the same way you could look at the election of Barack Obama. You know, clearly that is a sign of the massive shift that took place because of the civil rights movement in America, but it also kind of shines a light on the fact that the vast majority of black people in America's lives haven't improved at all over the last 25 or 30 years, and probably for many have got worse. And so I think in lots of ways, well, I look at history as a history of class struggle, right? I'm a Marxist, and I think that there was an upsurge in struggle a generation ago that kind of was a tide that brought everyone up, and I think all kinds of struggles emerged out of that and flowered and fought alongside each other. And I think some of the ideas and the ideologies that came out of that movement as it went down, like feminism, like black nationalism, or various other sets of ideas, I think were a sign of that movement going down and a sign of the division starting to appear inside of it. So, for me, I think that there's been a battle going on for centuries, for all of human history, really. And I think our side has been on a bit of a back foot for the last 20 years or so. We saw Thatcher in Britain, Reagan in America, and all the rest of it. But I don't think either side has won or lost. I think we're constantly pushing against the attacks that they're trying to push against us. And I think understanding it in those terms helps you to see why the Tories today and New Labour before them were pushing this idea of family values and all of that. If you want to privatise the whole of the public sector, and all the public services that we rely on, then you have to big up the family, because they're the only people, it's the mother and the wife and all of that who's going to pick up the pieces and take on that caring role that they're trying to take away. And I think in terms of women in the workforce, it's clearly the case they're not going to be pushed out again, but the attacks on public sector that are coming are going to affect thousands of women and men who work together. And I think the lesson we have to learn from the movements the last time round is that, united we're strong and divided we fall, really. And that's what socialist politics is about.
The next speaker will be followed by the gal in the hat.
Yeah, I wanted to come in first on the question that somebody asked about sort of women who now work and then end up oppressing other women who look after their children for them, because I don't think that is actually oppression. I think that's exploitation, because they're generally employing them. And I do think if you think the roots of women's oppression is about the family and the privatised sort of looking after and bringing up of childcare, women do it for free, or they pay somebody else, nurseries or whatever, at massive cost to themselves. Women are taxed at a huge rate when they work and have children. And I think there's a difference between being at home and being a mother, where in a sense you have nobody to fight against. You're completely atomised and on your own, and nobody to say, I don't want to do this anymore, this isn't right. At least if you are employed, you have somebody to fight against. And childminders can get together as a collective and begin to fight around being unionised, around getting wages, and puts them in a different position to just looking after your own children at home on your own. And therefore I think it is a step forward in terms of women's ability to fight back. Because ultimately, someone talked about work earlier, and I do think that yes, we have been sort of, cut back and we have less now than we had sort of, a number of years ago, but that's not just true for women, that's true for men as well. Over the last 30 years in Britain, I'm in Unison, my union's been shite. My union has allowed the Tory government to get away with it for 18 years, telling us to wait for Labour. We had a Labour government and we're told don't fight because it's our government and we don't want to get the Tories back. We got the Tories back and somehow they haven't got an answer to that now. And I think not just men, but women have paid, all of us, women have paid a bigger price for that, but I think we've all paid a price for that, and I think we've got to the point where people are saying they're not prepared to put up with that any longer. There is an anger, but also a massive insecurity, because things that we took for granted are not going to be here in the next couple of years. I was hoping to retire within the next 5 years. I now think I might have to work another 15, and you think that's a reality for loads of people. In Ireland they took a 20% pay cut. I can't afford a 20% pay cut because I can't live on what I am getting paid at the moment. There is a reality about people's lives that's making them angry. And I think the fact that women are in work gives them an ability to fight back. And when you do fight back, it changes you. When we were out on strike in defence of me and in defence of mental health services, it changed the people who were out on strike. Lots of you will have had delegation visits from people that I work with, and primarily it was women who came out and did that delegation stuff. And they came back, not the passive, quiet women that they went off that the world wants them to be, but actually angry women who were saying, no, we're not prepared to put up with it. And that's the real change and the real way forward that I think we'll see men and women fighting together to overthrow a society where none of us take personal responsibility for childcare, but we take collective.
The next speaker will be followed by the woman in the team at the back.
Hey, that was very touching just before. This was very good, all of them. I liked what you were saying about I've forgotten your name, sorry. Nina was saying about the man session, and I was wondering, as I never really know with any of... it's always something I'm kind of confused about, but obviously recessions cause backlashes, and you get... it's a sort of well-believed thing, I think, amongst certain young people especially, that recessions and times of poverty create good art, and kind of the emotions are higher. That's what some people have been saying. There's this idea that, say having a Tory government in will help the left organise itself. The more kind of the centre-left, like Labour, which was a wreck, and now it's not in power, there's less pressure on it. I thought about feminism as well, and how that would organise itself. And I thought it was interesting how Nina was saying that it was the men were getting fired because the women were getting paid less, although that entails obviously a shorter period of not actually worse for the women but worse for the men, and kind of worse for everyone, if that will eventually kind of allow the women to organise a bit more and then get higher wages after that. And just as a definition of feminism was, because feminism is a very ambiguous word, it essentially just means anyone who fights for the equality of men and women. So it's actually more of a feminism is not even that gender specific as far as I can tell, which I don't really know. I think that's it.
Well, thank you. The next speaker will be followed by the woman on the left hand red top.
Hiya. I just wanted to pick up a bit on the assumption that that now women are fully emancipated and fully in control of their bodies, and so how this may therefore lead to some kind of idea that when they are attacked sexually or otherwise, that they are somehow to blame. And it's sort of, I'm a Sussex student at Sussex University. Yep, exactly. And since starting, in my second year, there was a nude calendar of female Brighton and Sussex students, but that's since been banned by our union council, which is good, yeah. But there's also a pole dancing society was set up under the pretense of exercise, and there was a survey in our student newspaper, I think it was last year, about when women are sexually attacked, how far are they to blame? And there was a startling percentage of women who believe that when a woman is dressed provocatively, she is in some way to blame for her own attack. And there has also been a number of sexual attacks that then happened on our campus by the rugby team and various other sports teams that had a sort of a disproportionate amount of punishment given for the nature of the attacks on these women. But one of the things that did happen was that they somehow blamed the girls involved, saying that it was banter, lads banter, and that she didn't get the joke. So I just sort of wanted to something sort of that Judith mentioned in her talk, that somehow when a woman doesn't want to do something, when she doesn't want to, pose nude on the cover of Nuts magazine or have someone rub their genitals on her, that sort of somehow she's being a prude and isn't fully emancipated and isn't enough of a woman to take it. So I just sort of wanted to maybe highlight the sort of sinister side of the idea that women are fully emancipated, the assumption that they are, and they are in complete control. Thank you.
After the next speaker will be the woman at the front. Could I ask you to speak just for 2 minutes now? We've got to bring the speakers back in 5 minutes. Thanks.
Okay. I was reading Judith's article in the latest ISJ, and I was actually genuinely shocked to read the information that she described about what's happening on the campuses now. And I was thinking, I'm living in Germany at the moment. I was thinking, is that happening on our campuses too? I don't think so. Then someone did mention to me this morning that they had seen an advertisement in the metro the other day that said, push-up bra not enough, have a breast enlargement. That was one ad. And then recently I was walking through my campus, the Free University in Berlin, and I was looking at the pin board, looking at the posters, and while there wasn't an absolute bombardment of sexist imagery, the way that you describe in your article, there was an advertisement for make a little cash on the side while you're studying, become an escort, and this was one of the advertisements on the university pin board. So, I mean, not to the same extent by any means as what is happening in the UK, but it is an international phenomenon. I wanted to talk a little bit about Germany, which is, as everybody knows, run by a woman, Angela Merkel. Anyone who thinks that anyone in society who can argue that this is somehow a step forward for women is seriously mistaken. I don't seriously think that anyone in this room would believe that. But there's also, throughout her government, which actually she shares the leadership of the government with a gay man. So Germany, one of the biggest fourth biggest economy in the world now, is run by a woman and a gay man. There's not so many great things going on for the working class in Germany right now. The previous family minister, Ursula von der Leyen, there's now a term going around in Germany called von der Leyen woman. You can become a von der Leyen woman because she has 7 children and she manages to be a federal parliamentarian and do all these great things like making cuts to the family payments while squeezing people out and sacking workers from their jobs and reducing people's hours and so on and so forth. And this is the kind of politics that are being represented by a government that is being run by a woman. That said, I'm also from Australia, and we just elected our very first ever female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who was elected on... she comes from the left wing of the Social Democratic Party, but actually she was put into power by the right wing of her own party on the basis that she would be prepared to introduce a more aggressive policy on refugees, a more racist policy, and that she would do what needed to be done to crush working class resistance to any kind of recession that may happen in Australia, which hasn't quite happened yet, but will come.
There'll be the woman at the front and then the woman at the back of the room who indicated, and I'm afraid that'll be our last speaker.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say that it seems to me that the initial fight for feminism was a fight against a lot more, sort of tangible issues like, the vote and the law, abortion, and things like that, which, society was saying, no, you can't have these things, and feminists were saying, yes, we can. And now it seems to be a lot more subtle, and unless it's not so easy to say yes, no, that's it. It's more of a debate, more of an argument, and kind of it's harder to see the line. And say with lads mags and bunny girls and the sort of so-called liberation, it's harder to say yes, no, that's it. I think and I'm kind of worried about the sort of ideological implications of this, and sort of how how we do fight against this. An example of what really worried me is when example of a 2-year-old who was asking her dad for some ice cream, and he said no, and she sort of started to sort of pout her lips and make a sort of quite provocative sort of facial expression to sort of try and get what she wanted out of him. And I kind of thought, well, how the hell do you know how to do that? You're 2. Like, how did you learn that? And it's like, it starts so young. It's kind of like, well, how can we fight against this when, even the most astute and well-educated feminists, I suspect, probably don't see half of what's going on in terms of, the dominant ideology, and how young it begins. It kind of, I'm kind of wondering, how do we fight against that when it's so ingrained? But, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Does the person at the back of the room still want to speak? Yeah, this will be our last speaker, and then I'll bring in the main speakers to sum up.
Hi. I just wanted to... Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. I just wanted our speakers to talk a little bit about prostitution. I don't know if you guys know there are people who think that sex workers are... they're just workers as any other workers, and that they should have their rights and protection, and that the fight should be about giving them these fights and protections and fighting the state to provide this, while there are others who think that selling the body is unacceptable, and that that the fight should be about abolishing prostitution as a whole. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring the speakers back in reverse order. So Hester will speak first, and she'll get 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm good. I'll sneak around here. I think this... How's that? Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Really, really wonderful questions, really provocative. I won't be able to anywhere near cover all the issues that people raise, but I just want to pick up on a couple of them. On the issue of first world feminists and third world feminists and the global south and the rich north, I think everybody realizes that we're in a period of what people call neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism, in which the rich countries are trying to get richer and to impoverish the poor countries more. And I talk in my book about, in this context, the uses of mainstream or hegemonic feminism, particularly for the leadership in my country, using Western feminism as a weapon against third world women. And there's several aspects of that. One is, of course, the support that we have for the Afghan war and the Iraqi war by our female leadership, Hillary Clinton et al. And secondly is the economic assault that goes on and on against third world countries through structural adjustment programs. Many of you have studied this, which cuts social services very badly and puts everything then back on the shoulders of women. And then Western feminists, to add insult to injury, say, well, why aren't you liberated? Why aren't you like us? Why don't you care about our issues? And this came up famously at Nairobi in that International United Nations conference. You remember that? Where the Western women were saying, well, why aren't you all excited about your electoral access, and why aren't you all excited about abortion? And they're like, excuse me, we don't have sanitary napkins. We do not have running water. We do not have the most basic economic substructure. So we have different issues, and that's been a kind of dialogue of the deaf, although I think we're starting to bridge that now. So I think that to the extent that, what I'm arguing is that the extent that Western feminists are not aware of their complicity with our government's policies around the world, we are betraying other women, our sisters. So that's one point. Now, the second point is, and by the way, when people say, well, where is the women's movement? Look around the world. Gabriela in the Philippines is a very powerful women's movement. In Venezuela, under the Chavez government, there's a resurgence of women's activism, extraordinary political and social gains for women. So the women's movement is probably more palpable in third world situations than it is in the West. I'm not sure if that's exactly right, but okay. Next thing, I think this point came up several times today and also in my session last night. It's a really interesting point which I want to incorporate and think about, which is, on the one hand, women at work. The minute we enter the paid workforce, we're free to be exploited along with our brothers. On the other hand, it is true, and you can go back to Engels to think about this, that in the workforce, people are not atomized. They can be drawn together and they can work. And so some of the leadership in the resurgent services sector, unions, is by nurses, is by domestic workers. We've had fantastic organizing of domestic workers. And in fact, New York State is about to pass a bill called the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, which is going to give them what they have lacked since the 1930s, which is a minimum wage and other workers' rights. So that's an area of struggle. By the way, that's a cross-class alliance. So the employers who are women who are going to work because they have immigrant women helping them, they could fight for the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights or an equivalent thing here and do something to alleviate their guilt. And on the sex workers, I have a section in my book on that also. That's a long-standing debate within feminism. And whenever I teach this, I agree with both sides. You know, it's like, sex work is terrible, it's exploitative, it objectifies women. That's true. Sex work is an option for women, it's economic empowerment, it's a form of service work. That's also true. It's an insoluble thing because why? It's assuming capitalism as a system and commodification. So you sell your body just like you sell your body if you're working on an airplane, right? In part. I mean, mutatis mutandis, but still. So I don't think the sex work issue can be solved within a capitalist framework. But I guess I slightly come down on the side of the right of sex workers to consider themselves workers and to get rights as they have in some countries. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Nina will speak next.
Yeah, just a few quick points then. Just to pick up actually on kind of some of the things that Hester was saying, really I couldn't agree more about what she was saying about a kind of global women's liberation. It's a huge, huge problem if half the world thinks that feminism is about buying shoes and the other half thinks it's about access to basic kind of resources and not being raped and killed. Okay, and obviously a proper Marxist feminism would pay attention precisely to class and women all over the world. It wouldn't restrict its kind of vision to kind of questions of the rich world. At all. So, I mean, and as Hester was saying, I think there's been much more progress in recent years trying to think about the global context in that sense. And I suppose I would just simply say, well, but for thinking very critically about the bad uses, the uses and abuses of the term feminism in the 90s and 2000s, particularly in relation to war. Someone brought up war, which is huge question. We have to be incredibly wary about those kind of false uses and immoral uses of feminism to justify invasion, particularly in relation to things like Islamophobia and so on. This idea that Western feminism is going to somehow liberate women and the rest of the world. It's a terrible and incorrect story. Somebody asked about the link between culture and the economic sphere. I would say absolutely yes. I'm not saying we should only look at economics or politics in that way. There clearly are there are obvious relations between the two. I just think if you focus on culture solely about culture and just talk about things like lifestyle choice and so on, it doesn't really explain the problem you're trying to address. I think, personally, I think that the ambient pressure for young women to present themselves nicely and to look pretty and so on, for me, can only be explained in the context of work. What does it mean to sell yourself as a good employee? What does it mean to be a kind of perky worker and so on? And I think the so-called sexualization of young women has to be understood in that context as a kind of demand to self-exploit, right? It's easier for companies, for employers, if people exploit themselves already. You don't have to shout at them to dress in a certain way if they already do it. So I think that's my understanding of the link between culture and economics in relation to work. And I suppose just finally, I mean, there is a kind of historical point about the kind of depression of wages that happened in the 20th century. I mean, men's wages were depressed so that women could enter the workforce. Right? This is a kind of crucial economic fact. It's not simply that women are paid less. We know they are. They're in more precarious and part-time work. It's that all work, all pay has been depressed, right? So that this fantasy, like the 50s model, let's say, and there's a complicated story about that, but the 50s model, say, of the male breadwinner being able to support his wife and kids and house, is no longer, nobody has that fantasy anymore. Even if you're a upper middle class person, you both assume you have to work or something. It's not, there's a kind of overall sort of like, not even stagnation, but depression of wages. And I think the positive things that people were saying about organisation, yes, precisely, women are organising at work, and we've seen a kind of rise of very strong female union activists, and this is obviously only a kind of positive thing. On the question of sex work, I absolutely share Hester's complicated, ambivalent feelings towards it. I veer, though, towards thinking of it as a form of work, and as such should be unionised. In fact, given my critique of work, I would suggest that all sex workers should go on strike, but then all workers should go on strike anyway.
The final speaker is Judith. Just before she speaks, don't rush off at the end. The speakers are all going to be signing the books at the front of the stage. So, Judith.
Right, well, thanks for a brilliant discussion, and it's great to have been part of the panel. I mean, there's so many things to come back on, but I'll just try and address some of the themes. And I think one of the themes was the relationship between exploitation, you know, being at work, being exploited, and oppression, and the whole thing about the role of women in the workforce, and also just the fact that actually all women suffer some sort of oppression, don't they, in the system? It isn't the case that only working class women suffer oppression. Oppression cuts across class. You know, some of the MPs on the big money and everything else faced horrible sexism, didn't they? You remember the best of Breastminster? It was all the MPs and who had the biggest breasts. This was in the Sun. You know, all this sort of stuff. This is sexist, isn't it? And these women suffer it. But I think when we have to look at that, the relationship between oppression and exploitation, we have to see that actually where exploitation and oppression intersect, where you have a situation where you're exploited, where you're an employee or worker and you're oppressed, whether it's through racism, whether it's through women's oppression, whether it's through homophobia, whatever it is, this makes your experience of your oppression is intensified by that class relationship, by you being exploited, by you being a worker. But, and this is where maybe I slightly differ perhaps with Nina's sort of, you know, sort of characterization, I suppose, of work, because in a way I feel like it's just been portrayed as another burden, and I feel like it is actually the key to us being able to fight and go forward. I think actually, you know, that I don't actually think that men's wages were brought down in order for women to come in the workforce. The post-war boom drew in huge numbers because the system needed more workers. Now, obviously, we all know, you know, women have worked for many generations, working class women in particular, you know, while the ruling class women were sort of fainting and, you know, playing the pianoforte and stuff, you know, working class women were working. So this isn't just brand new. But of course, the big expansion did come after the Second World War and the post-war boom. But I think this became the key to our emancipation, the key for us to be able to fight back. And therefore, for me, you know, it is, you know, women are a permanent part of the workforce. We're not just in precarious, you know, jobs on the edge. And we are joining unions at a faster rate than men. Now, obviously, some of the men's jobs have been, you know, have been cut back. But the fact is, we're well and truly part of an organised part of the workforce. Now, even for those women and men who are parts of more of the precarious sections of the working class, still the way forward for them to win anything is for the organised working class to go forward and fight. That's the thing, isn't it? There's no other social force in society, both that has the potential political and economic power to fight back, but also that it has an internal, inherent drive to unity. Regardless of if you've got a racist worker or a really sexist, chauvinist worker or whatever. Ultimately, in times of struggle, they are forced to unite over that, forced to fight together, and actually forced to overcome divisions. And there's no other social force in society that has that. A couple of specific points on prostitution. I think actually prostitutes should have a right to organise and be in unions. They are some of the most vulnerable women who face danger and everything else, and the state and everything else. But ultimately, I don't believe it is just like another job. Actually, a lot of jobs will have to happen under socialism, whether it's baking, whether it's medical care and everything else. This is a job I do not believe, or this is a function I don't believe will be either necessary or desirable under socialism. And actually, the commodification of our bodies, of our sexuality, of our bodies is, you know, a deeply alienated form of commodity and buying and selling in capitalism, and I don't believe it will exist. Actually, I don't believe we'll be buying and selling anything under socialism, let alone our bodies. But I think just another couple of specifics on the raunch culture stuff. And yes, I don't think we should get too obsessed, you know, about the developments on one level. But I think for many young women and men, it is how they face the raw reality of women being oppressed and that mismatch. You know, that's, for many of them, that is what is their experience. They haven't experienced the worrying about maternity leave yet, or the pension age, or some of those other things. And therefore, this is raw, you know, absolute bile that is coming out of popular culture that people want to react to. And I think for us, what do we need? What sort of politics do we need? And I believe what happened with the women's liberation movement, we won lots of gains, but it came up against the limits of a movement that was only on talking about women's equality and women's, you know, the way forward for women. Because actually you came across the limits of the system. Capitalism still exists. And therefore we have to have a politics that talks about actually getting rid of the system from which women's oppression came, from where it's rooted. And that is why, for me, a political movement isn't a form of feminism. It is a form of a socialist politics that sees the idea that we can fight to bring everybody up. It isn't just about putting women at the top. I want more women in every part of society. They shouldn't not be allowed to be a boss. You know, women aren't just nice, cuddly people that, you know, we know that putting women at the top doesn't make a big difference, but I don't think they should be denied the right to be at every level being snotty bosses just like men. But I know that's not the answer. What is the answer? The answer is for a united movement from below, self-emancipation of women workers, of male workers, of all of us. We are the social force that can make a difference. Revolutionary change, and in the history, you have seen that when there's been revolutionary change from below, when there's been a challenge from below, then actually the question of women comes to the fore. Not just about equal pay, but also about things like sexual liberation and what we can wear and how we... Look at the Spanish Civil War, look at the Russian Revolution, look at the 1980s revolutions in Eastern Europe. All of these brought these sort of questions to the fore. So for me, that's the potential for hope, that we do have power. We don't have to wait for somebody else to do it for us. We fight on every single issue today, and the crisis will be difficult for women. The welfare state, the public sector, lots of women's jobs, and lots of things that women need in terms of services. So we're going to have a really united campaign, but actually for me, the working class is the force that's got the ability to challenge it. So I'll leave it there.